Our guest today for the second episode of Let's Talk Social Change is the president of the SRC at UNSW, Nayonika Bhattacharya, who is a highly accomplished go-getter entering the final year of her combined arts law degree. In addition to this, Nayonika is also the president of the Animal and Environmental Law Society at UNSW, as well as having been the 2019 Study New South Wales International Student Finalist, Multicultural Hepatitis and HIV New South Wales Ambassador, as well as being Ambassador of Hockey Multicultural New South Wales, and the Ambassador for the Institute for Economics and Peace for 2021. Aside from this, Nayonika is also the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Lived Experience Advisor at UNSW and an advisor to the Black Dog Institute, as well as being the City of Sydney International Student Leadership Ambassador from 2018 to 2020. Thank you, Nayonika, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's absolutely exciting to be here.
All right, let's get stuck into it. Let's start with uni. So you told me that you're studying arts law. What drew you towards that degree combination, and why those two subjects?
Yeah, absolutely. I finally actually was intending to go into a men's degree, like most people sort of think in high school. And I sort of realized that that wasn't it for me. And then I really sort of dug into what do I really enjoy as a person. And what do I really want to, do with my future? It's a big question to have at the age of 16, 17 to, what are you doing for the rest of your life? I really chose law because I think something that really stuck with me is that it doesn't teach you just about fighting wrong, but it teaches you about how to go about making the things right and fixing things that are wrong. And that's one of the main reasons why I chose to do law. I chose to go into arts with a major in politics and a minor in psychology because I think it's quite fascinating as young people we're scared of politics as a concept, but we shouldn't be. It's in everyday life that you find politics. It's in everything that you do as well. And I think politics has this room for people to be themselves and people to fight for things that they want themselves. And that's one of the main reasons why I got into that combination.
I think with law, that's very relatable for a lot of people, right? Especially the people who might be from multicultural backgrounds or be in the queer community or be migrants. A lot of people are drawn to it because of experience of discrimination or seeing how people might be treated differently. And so it gives you unique empathy and wanting to change things.
Yeah.
So it's really good to hear. And we see that reflected through your student life role. So what I'm particularly interested in is your role as the president of the SRC and your past roles within the SRC and other parts of student politics. So what does your current role as president involve? And what I'm particularly interested in is why did you decide to join the SRC? So what was the satisfaction in that for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's quite fascinating. You're 12, 13, and at that point you're like, I want to be 20, I want to be an adult, and I want to get it all back together. And then you are 20, you pass through that 18, 19, 20 stage, and then you start finding things that you're not happy with. University is sort of pitched to be this thing where everything almost magically seems to be fine, it seems to be okay, and the answers are there. But they're not always there because you'll realize that the biggest secret is that no one knows what they're doing. Everyone is quite, happy making it till they're making it. And one of the main reasons that I got into the SRC was because I think that realization hit me, which is everyone's just figuring it out as we go. So in my past roles, I started as the first international officer back in 2018, moved on to become the welfare officer, then was the general secretary last year, and I'm the president this year. And the main reason I fell into it was I just felt like as an international student, there wasn't a community for me, that it almost felt like I was just doing, photo ops, and it was a PR stint that I was constantly doing, and I wanted to reach out to people who struggled with being a third culture kid like myself, people who were always hip enough to be in the in crowd, but were always the other. And I think it's one of the main reasons that drew me to this whole conversation where young people have a lot of empathy, and tapping into that network and source of empathy was really important, and creating the community so other people didn't feel the way I did was really important, and that's how I landed into it.
Right, wow. All great reasons. One of the main roles of student politics and student representation is trying to address some major issues facing students. So what, in your perspective, are the main issues facing students now? Of course, being alive to the fact that we are still going through a pandemic, there are issues we've just seen today, for example, that houses are becoming increasingly unaffordable in Sydney.
Yeah.
Are there any specific issues that you think face international students versus domestic students as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So we get asked what the SRC is all about a lot, and the simplest way to explain it to people is everything that's going well, we want to make sure it keeps going well, and everything that's not going so well, we want to make sure that changes. Having said that, in this space, the role of student councils and student politics is to have these conversations. It's to sort of ruffle the feathers that need to be ruffled. It's to knock on doors that haven't been knocked on, and move from there. And we lend a lot of sort of importance, attention, a lot of discussion through social issues that exist. And these are things that have always existed, but these are things that are bothering us a lot more because you find through real life examples that young people are the ones who are, sort of bearing the brunt of a lot of decisions that we haven't made. Climate change is something that bothers us a lot. The housing bubble crisis is a huge thing that bothers all of us. Increased risk of homelessness, loss of dignity, employment issues. These are things that bother all of us. So the SRC really lends itself into making sure that people are advocated for. And my role as the president, this involves not just talking to people in the management, but also talking to external organizations, talking to politicians, talking to institutions that are importantly, having conversations that are focusing on how policy can be influenced, how policy can be changed, or policy can be created in this space to make sure young people are protected and safe. Because it's almost unfair that we tell young people all throughout their lives in school that you should dream big, that when you dream big, that at the end of the tunnel, there'll be someone to help you out, but then you suddenly throw them into university, and you don't have all of these opportunities for them to dream big safely. And I find that quite unfair. And it's scary, like as a young person, if you don't have the right support mechanisms, if you're not someone who's privileged enough to have a family to look after you, if you don't come from a background where you're exposed to people who are as successful as you want to see them, it's difficult for you to navigate this space. And it's really important that we as a student council have these conversations because we might be young, but we're not naive. And we know that we have the intelligence, we have the energy, we just don't have the money. So I think that's what the SRC does a lot of. And it's important to keep pushing forward. And as I said, politics bleeds into everyday things that you do. It's in the way you dress, it's in the way you're allowed to speak, it's in the way you're allowed to behave, it's in the way you're allowed to eat and drink and what you're consuming, including your medication. All of these discussions lead to everyday things, which is why student politics is really important because young people have the energy. They just need to be heard, and that's what we do at the SRC.
That's really good to hear. I mean, I think one of the very underestimated aspects of students, the strength that they bring, is that they can bring a fresh perspective to issues that are currently plaguing society, because they're not as conditioned or acclimatized to some of the issues that are going on. And we saw this in our previous episode, for example, when Mark Kirby talked to us about the freedom rides, or for instance, about young people pushing for LGBT liberation. Now, I want to go more specifically into what student politics can achieve. So what's one major issue that the UNSW SRC or the National Union of Students have campaigned on most recently? And what results did that yield? And what do you think are the next steps?
Yeah, absolutely. So an important issue that the SRC was behind was affordable housing. And it's something that affects both domestic and international students alike. When the pandemic hit, we knew that the system was broken, that there were cracks and faults in a lot of cases, but we didn't know the extent of it. And that really came down on us because young people with disabilities, on support from the government, getting NDIS, or First Nation students, or students in very tricky positions for getting Centrelink, they struggled. They were not included in the JobSeeker and JobKeeper payments, and you essentially, let the young people out to dry, and it's a difficult situation to be in because you're experiencing something that most people will never understand. You're in the middle of a pandemic. It's like something you've never seen before. It's out of a dystopian movie. To us it was just novels back in 2010, but suddenly we're living it. So you've got this whole situation in front of you. Housing was a huge issue. Food was a huge issue. And we found that all of this affects a young person's dignity. And when young people's dignity is affected, it affects the way that they can be socially involved in a community. And when you don't have thriving, healthy young people, it really affects the way you as a country can go forward as well. So something that we really worked on and had all of last year was subsidized accommodation at UNSW. So people could apply for very subsidized accommodation based on a needs basis, and they could stay there for the entire year. And it was really important to make sure people, were not homeless, did not have to enter risky couch surfing situations, or essentially live in small places in very cramped conditions. Another thing that we kicked off in 2020 and still ongoing is the Food Hub. So it's a free resource where you can collect healthy, fresh, nutritious food, other amenities as well. So you've got sanitary and hygiene products that people can go collect for free. And it's important because you want young people to be able to look at themselves in the mirror and not feel like they're a charity case. Because a lot of young people felt like they would have to beg, grovel, and just crawl for the most basic needs, and it's not fair. You should not be left behind because it's not your fault that a pandemic started. And so those are the two initiatives that we started. Something that has seen a huge success and a lot of positive work that's being done by past NUS officers and is being continued is consent education and sex education. It's fantastic to see that consent education is being mandated in all Australian schools from 2023, but the university space is still an unsafe space. Going back to the research that came out in 2017 and 2018, any rape on campus is a huge movement that started in Australian campuses because it's a huge problem that Australian people face when they go to study on their campuses. And it's a campaign that we will be continuing as well, just to make sure we have conversations about things that make accessing campuses unsafe, which, going back to your initial introduction, leaves people with disabilities, queer people, women, non-binary people, people with caring responsibilities or other conditions and very vulnerable, and it's just not fair.
And that's really important as well, because a lot of these cultural issues in terms of how we educate people translate into real life. University is real life, but it translates into the workforce. It translates into positions of power. For example, with Parliament, we saw the revelations with the High Court with Dyson Hayden a couple of years ago. What I'm also interested in is the fact that you talked about empowerment. Another few issues that have plagued students, of course, is in terms of social security. So with youth allowance, which is another form of social security, that was less than New Start, which is now called Job Seeker. There's so many changes in the names. And until recently, and we were having this conversation before, is that international students were capped to only being able to work 20 hours a week. And that's after paying upfront for their tuition, needing to study full time. The structures are just not built for people to be able to support themselves. And international students in particular were also not given social security payments. So the idea of empowerment is great, but that needs to be followed up through robust and supportive policies. What I want to move on to, and this goes back to politics now, playing a role in student politics. Now, we know that student politics has been a breeding ground for future politicians and prominent holders of public office. So this has included former prime ministers, for example, Prime Minister Julia Gillard and Malcolm Turnbull, and our previous guest, the Honourable Michael Kirby. Do you think student politics still has a role to play in shaping contemporary Australian politics? And do you think its influence or potency is any different to before? So, for example, there are more tertiary education pathways than ever before, but progressive student politicians from past generations have often lambasted the current generation, saying the playing thing's too safe. Do you think I postulate there's two factors. One is that universities of the 70s or 60s or 80s, they didn't encompass as much of the population as they do now. So they had sort of an exclusive ground. For example, take law. We're both stuck, I recently finished law, but for example, UCID was the only law school in Australia, in New South Wales until 1971. So they gave people who were studying that degree a unique sort of voice and unique access, and that's different to how it is now. The second issue could be the fact that there's a digital space. It's a lot harder to campaign than it is to sort of go on the ground. And the fact that we tend to lock ourselves in the echo chambers online can also mean that people can just choose not to listen to particular campaigns, particular issues, and we tend to curate our own realities. What do you think about these barriers? And do you think student politics still is relevant to shaping big decisions in Canberra or Macquarie Street?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very fascinating concept, which is it's not effective anymore. And I feel like you hear these terms quite a lot. And I like to think of it as a phenomenon of being called out. But I want everyone to sort of step back and think of it as an opportunity to be invited in instead of being called out. And the way it works is student politics doesn't look the same anymore. It's because the people involved in politics are not the same anymore. It's not the same, you don't just have Anglo-Saxon faces in politics anymore. You've got people like you and I, people like Penny Wong, speaking in politics. You've got people from, you've got like Senator Lydia Thorpe in politics. You've got a lot more representation of different communities because those are the people who make up what the everyday Australian looks like. And I think that's why politics looks a lot more different, because when you have an inclusive political conversation, something that we all need to remember is that activism then doesn't look the same. Activism does not look like only, taking to the streets and protesting. That is a very important thing that you should be doing. And it's very effective, but activism also looks different for people who have disabilities who can't participate. Activism looks different in the way that people reject workplace culture and advocate for more safer workplace, policies in place. Activism looks like talking to your HR team. Activism looks for making sure that young people are employed in these roles that we talked about, so quite literally putting your money where your mouth is, which is why it doesn't look like the same politics of what the progressives...
As in marches and just protests, but there's all these other avenues as well.
Absolutely, and I'm not saying that, we don't absolutely have room for marches and protests. We do. Look at the climate strike. Greta Thunberg, she started that. We have fantastic climate strikes, national days of action that take place every year. We took to the streets positively with peace on, Invasion Day rallies as well. We take to the streets when there's discussions about the lack of safety and sexual harassment on campuses for women. We have reclaimed the night rallies across Sydney.
We also had the March for Justice last year.
Absolutely, we have them every year. It's because we had the very peaceful discussion and demonstration for the religious discrimination bill that was proposed in the Parliament. So we have all of these things in there.
Which was shelved recently as well. So activism works.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got all of this work, but then behind all of these demonstrations and rallies and marches, you need to realize there's a lot of activism being done behind the books as well. It's calling a lot of people, it's emailing a lot of people, it's, rocking up to work and talking to your bosses and letting them know that this is not okay. It's joining your unions and making sure that all of this work that you're doing needs to mean something, because you can show up to all of these marches, rallies and things like that, but if all of that work is not sustainable and not carried out long term, it's going to mean nothing. So, which is why what we do these days does not look the same. It looks different because, as you said, like in the almost, fourth wave of feminism sense of things, the digital space is so far and wide. So people I've never met in, say, Central Africa, and people I've never met in South America and, North America are connecting with me. They're telling me how they're organizing for their communities, they're sharing their resources and their lessons, and I'm following that as well. I could be sitting in Japan tomorrow and I could be doing the same thing there. I could be sitting in India tomorrow and be doing the same thing there. So all of us young people are connected a lot more. And it's not that we're not showing up. We're conserving our energy, putting it in places where we know we're getting actual change. And the way that actual change looks like and the way that energy being put in looks like can be quite different, which I don't think is a bad thing, because it also means that we are then protecting communities and minorities, as we know from research and from evidence-based conversations. They're the most vulnerable. They're the ones who are exposed to police brutality. They're the ones who are exposed to other forms of discrimination, which could be casual racism as well, which could be overt discrimination as well, could be microaggressions.
And unconscious bias and hiring.
Absolutely. And not to mention all of the internalized bias that we see as well. And that creates other avenues of self-hatred and self-discrimination as well. And which is why, these diversified mechanisms of activism, it keeps these vulnerable communities safe. It allows us to create information in a way that also doesn't, rely on their emotional labor as well. Because at the end of the day, all of the information we need out there now to create social change exists on the internet. It's just a matter of putting in the right words, looking it up and going from there. And I think that's the main difference you're seeing. And so student politics absolutely, without a doubt, has the space to have these conversations. It's the work of institutions like Equality Australia, student councils, guilds, unions across the country, student organizations across the country, youth networks across the country, challenging things like the religious discrimination bill, showing up to climate strikes every year, pushing our MPs, our senators to have important conversations, our local councillors to have important conversations. These are things that are creating change because we're the people who are going to be living 40 years from now. We don't want these current work conditions. It's young people fighting for union changes and things like that. So it absolutely has the space, it absolutely has the relevance, and it's super important. I get why people would be complacent because it's almost just like we go through the process of doom scrolling, and sometimes that's how politics is presented to you. But I think when you switch that perspective and take it as an invitation to walk in and change how your own life turns out, I think we'll have a lot more people participating in it. And we need to spread the message that activism does not look the same. What you can do is valuable regardless of whatever others tell you.
That's really interesting that you mentioned doom scrolling. So that was one of the main motivations behind this podcast being started, is that yes, you can feel very miserable looking at all these things going on, but you have to take one step and then the next step and actually do something proactive, because there's always going to be something wrong that's going on. But the only way you make change is by actually just making a start. And so on that note, and speaking about proactivity, what do you think are the current barriers to entry for students getting involved, whether it's activism on campus or elsewhere? Because when we look at social media, we have sort of seen some of the risks that come with it. It's that it is so transparent and scrutinized. It's that everything you say is so permanent. The other thing is, of course, is bullying and trolling. And we also see, physical threats being made, other violent threats also being made, just harassment, discrimination. Are these barriers to entry for students to enter student politics or just politics at large? And how do you address them?
Yeah, I would absolutely be a fool to say otherwise. That these risks don't exist. These risks are absolutely real, like showing up to protests, posting things online, being told, being harassed at your workplace, being followed, being sent random letters, threatening letters as well, having it affect your mental health, having it affect your social reputation. These are very real risks that affect people who choose to get involved in this space. But I think that's also one of the major reasons why, as people who are in the current student politics space, we need to push for better policy and better legislation in this space. We need to be talking about digital safety of people who are, engaging in conversation. As civilians, it's important that we are allowed to exercise our civic opinion on things, and we should not be trolled for these things. It's important that when we are showing up to rallies and protests and demonstrations, that we do so in a manner that we are protected and we're safe. But it's important to realize that no matter what you do, these things are always going to feel scary. While these barriers exist, while the reality exists, when you show up in large numbers, you can't ignore people. So if it's just myself showing up, it's definitely scary. But if 4 of us and if 5 other of our peers show up, it's going to be far less daunting for people to show up and have those conversations with each other. And so the barriers don't necessarily exist in the same traditional sense. You can now be more easily involved than ever before. You want to write a letter to an MP? Go for it. You want to door knock together? Go for it. You want to distribute flyers and raise concerns? Go for it. You want to send mass emails and let people know that these are the issues you're experiencing? Go for it. You want to call council meetings? You can do it. You want to stand for an election? You can do it. The opportunities are just beyond the sky at the moment. But these realistic sort of fears are quite there, but I think it's one of the main reasons why you need to sort of bite the bullet and just take a plunge and really go into it, because you'll realize that it's not just you, because when you take that one step, there will be at least 20 other people who are feeling just like yourself. And when you show up in numbers, seeing that there is an appetite for this, there will be a push to change all of the protection mechanisms around these things as well.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for giving up your time to join our podcast today. And the main takeaway, and the same as last week essentially, is that there are so many opportunities to be able to go make a change. And just reflecting on some of the stuff that we learned today is that student politics, more than ever, is actually easier to join and canvass and look at, because you're able to see different parties' policies, you're able to connect with people more easily. And at the end of the day, it's not like universities in Australia are just sort of reduced to, people from an exclusive class.
Yeah.
It's a lot more inclusive than ever before. And it'd be really great to see more people join that space, especially people who are very passionate and make a difference both on campus and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you.